The moment my family handed me the most insulting wedding gift of my life, they expected the entire room to laugh, and they did. What they didn't know was that my grandmother had been waiting years for this exact moment, and the second I opened her gift, my mother's smile vanished, the laughter died in everyone's throat, and the wedding hall fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. A few seconds earlier, crystal glasses had chimed beneath the warm glow of chandeliers. Soft music floated through the ballroom while cameras flashed from every direction. Then my mother stood with the confidence of someone directing a performance. She had rehearsed many times in her head. "We saved the best gift for last," she announced. People leaned forward with excited smiles. A wrapped box, much smaller than the expensive presents stacked beside the stage, was placed into my hands. The paper was covered in bright ribbons that looked festive from a distance but strangely childish up close. I noticed my cousins exchanging knowing glances before I even untied the bow. The room already knew something I didn't. Inside the box sat a faded baby blanket, a cracked plastic piggy bank with its bottom missing, and a handwritten note. "For the daughter who was always a burden, at least now someone else has to pay for you." Laughter exploded across the hall. Not everyone laughed. Some guests stared into their wine glasses. Others looked away, pretending not to notice. My husband squeezed my hand so tightly it almost hurt. But even he seemed frozen by the cruelty unfolding in front of hundreds of people. I didn't cry. I simply looked at my mother. She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who believed humiliation was the perfect wedding toast. For most of my life, she had mastered these performances. Birthdays, graduations, family dinners, every celebration somehow became another opportunity to remind everyone that I was the disappointment she never wanted. She always hid her insults behind jokes, and the family always rewarded her with laughter instead of silence. Tonight was supposed to be her greatest show. She thought she had written the ending. Then I heard the slow, unmistakable tap of a wooden cane against the marble floor. My grandmother stood. At 90 years old, her movements were careful, but her eyes were sharper than anyone else's in the room. She carried a small velvet box that looked ordinary enough to be forgotten among the mountains of wedding gifts. "I believe," she said quietly, "it's finally time for mine." No one interrupted her, not even my mother, because for the first time all evening my grandmother wasn't looking at me. She was looking directly at her daughter, and there was something in her expression that made the confidence disappear from my mother's face before I'd even untied the ribbon. My name is Emily, and by the time I stood in my wedding dress holding that velvet box, I had spent 28 years learning that, in my family, love always came with conditions I could never seem to meet. My mother measured worth in appearances, and I was the child who constantly ruined the picture she wanted the world to see. I wasn't rebellious or irresponsible. I simply refused to become the version of me she could control. My older brother Daniel was the golden child. His mistakes were called ambition. My achievements were dismissed as luck. Family dinners revolved around his promotions, his vacations, his future, while my milestones were acknowledged only long enough to change the subject. Eventually, I stopped competing for attention because I realized the outcome had been decided long before. I was old enough to understand the game. My father rarely disagreed with my mother. Silence became his safest habit, and over the years it quietly became everyone else's. Even relatives who cared about me learned that challenging her usually created more trouble than ignoring me. Only one person consistently saw through the performance. My grandmother never interrupted my mother in public, but afterward she would quietly remind me that people who constantly diminish others are usually protecting fragile versions of themselves. As I grew older, I built a life beyond family expectations. I worked 2 jobs to finish college without asking my parents for money. I started a successful career, bought my own home, and learned that peace often comes from creating distance rather than winning arguments. None of it impressed my mother. Every accomplishment threatened the story she had spent years telling everyone, that I was incapable without her guidance. When I met my husband, Ethan, he noticed something I had stopped noticing myself. Every family gathering left me apologizing for things that were never my fault. I apologized for speaking too much, for speaking too little, for succeeding, for setting boundaries, even for accepting compliments. He never told me to confront them. He simply treated me with the kind of quiet respect that made years of disrespect impossible to ignore. Still, I accepted the wedding invitation with cautious hope. I convinced myself that one important day might finally be bigger than old grudges. Looking back, I realized my mother had been planning her performance. What I didn't realize was that my grandmother had been preparing for it even longer. The insults didn't begin when the gifts were opened. By then, they had already been woven into the day, so carefully that anyone looking from the outside could mistake them for simple oversights. When I arrived at the venue that morning, my mother barely looked up from her clipboard. She greeted the florist with more warmth than she greeted me, then adjusted a centerpiece while saying, "Try not to make today about yourself." I smiled because every reply I imagined would only become another story she could use against me. During the photographs, she insisted Daniel stand beside her while I was quietly shifted to the edge of every family portrait. Each adjustment came with a pleasant smile and a gentle, "just for balance," though everyone knew exactly what was being rearranged. At lunch, my aunt complimented my dress before my mother interrupted to point out that it hadn't come from the boutique she had recommended. The table laughed politely, as if criticism wrapped in a joke somehow became kindness. Even the seating chart carried her signature. Ethan and I were placed far from my grandparents while Daniel and his wife sat beside them at the head table. When I asked the wedding coordinator if there had been a mistake, she glanced nervously toward my mother before quietly saying, "I was told those seats were non-negotiable." Every small moment carried the same invisible message. You are here, but you are not the center of your own story. I noticed guests exchanging uncertain glances whenever my mother spoke. Some looked uncomfortable enough to intervene, yet none of them did. Years of watching her control every gathering had taught them that silence was easier than confrontation. Only my grandmother refused to play along. She didn't challenge my mother directly. Instead, she watched from across the room with calm, patient eyes, as though she were waiting for a particular line in a play she already knew by heart. Once our eyes met, she gave me the smallest nod. Not comforting, not apologetic. Certain, it was the kind of look that said she had seen every quiet humiliation, counted every calculated slight, and still believed the final act belonged to someone else. At the time, I thought she was asking me to endure just a little longer. I would soon discover she was asking me to trust her. As the applause faded after the speeches, I realized something had quietly changed inside me. It wasn't anger. Anger had carried me through too many years already, only to leave me exhausted while nothing else changed. Standing beneath the warm lights of the reception hall, listening to conversations resume as though my mother's small humiliations were perfectly ordinary, I understood that I no longer wanted her approval. I simply wanted the truth to exist in the open. That realization arrived the moment she called everyone's attention to the special family gift. She wasn't trying to celebrate my marriage. She was trying to preserve the role she had assigned me since childhood. The daughter who could always be reduced to the punchline. As laughter echoed around the room after I opened the box, I looked from face to face. Some guests smiled uncertainly. Others seemed deeply uncomfortable. For the first time, I noticed that many people weren't laughing because the joke was funny. They were laughing because everyone else was. That mattered. Because silence, I realized, was just as contagious. I folded the cruel note carefully instead of crumpling it. My hands were steady. My breathing slowed. My mother watched me with quiet anticipation, waiting for tears or an argument that would confirm every story she had ever told about me. I gave her neither. Instead, I thanked the guests for coming, placed the box gently back on the table, and stepped aside without a single accusation. The room grew uncertain. My refusal to react had interrupted the performance she had spent years perfecting. Without my anger, there was no scene to control, no emotional outburst to justify her behavior. Then I heard the measured tap of my grandmother's cane approaching across the marble floor. She stopped beside me and placed the small velvet box into my hands. "This belongs to you now," she said softly, her voice carrying farther than it should have in the suddenly quiet hall. "And it's time everyone learns why." As I lifted the lid, I understood that my grandmother hadn't come to rescue me. She had come to finish a story my mother believed she had buried forever. Inside the velvet box rested a brass key, a sealed envelope, and a folder whose edges had softened with age. My grandmother didn't rush me. She simply waited while the room watched in complete silence. "I asked my attorney to prepare everything years ago," she said, her voice steady. "I hoped I'd never need to open that file." The word attorney changed the atmosphere immediately. My mother's expression tightened for the first time all day. I broke the wax seal on the envelope and unfolded a notarized letter bearing my grandmother's signature alongside that of her lawyer. Attached were copies of property records, family trust documents, and several handwritten letters dating back more than 20 years. My grandmother had anticipated questions, arguments, even denial. Every document was dated, witnessed, and legally certified. Nothing relied on memory alone. She had spent years preserving facts while everyone else relied on carefully repeated stories. The first letter explained everything. When my grandfather passed away, he had left instructions that one particular family property, a lakeside cottage that had belonged to his parents, would eventually become mine. My mother had volunteered to manage the paperwork until I reached adulthood. Instead, she quietly told relatives the property had been sold to cover debts. It hadn't. The records showed the cottage had remained untouched all those years, with my grandmother retaining legal control after discovering the deception. Rather than confront her daughter immediately, she transferred the property into a protected trust, instructing her attorney to release every document only if my mother ever publicly tried to humiliate me again. "This was never about revenge," my grandmother said, looking directly at my mother. "It was about waiting until the truth could no longer be hidden." No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The facts spoke with a calm certainty that years of manipulation never could. For the first time in my life, my mother wasn't facing my emotions. She was facing undeniable evidence. No one reached for another drink. No one whispered. The ballroom remained, suspended in a silence so complete that even the photographers lowered their cameras. My mother opened her mouth twice before any words emerged. That's not the whole story." It was the first time all evening she sounded uncertain. My grandmother didn't argue. She simply nodded toward the folder in my hands. "Read the last page." I turned to the final document. It was a signed statement from the attorney confirming that every attempt my mother had made to claim ownership of the cottage had been formally rejected years earlier. Each request had been documented. Every conversation had been preserved. There was even a letter in my mother's own handwriting acknowledging that she understood the property was never hers to control. She had known the truth all along. The color drained from her face. Around the room, relatives who had laughed only minutes before slowly began connecting. Years of uncomfortable memories. The jokes, the half-truths, the stories that had always painted me as ungrateful while presenting my mother as endlessly generous. Viewed separately, they had seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern no one could ignore. Daniel stared at the papers before quietly stepping away from our mother's side. My father lowered his eyes, not in confusion, but in recognition. His silence suddenly looked less like peace and more like regret. I closed the folder without another word. There was nothing left to prove. My grandmother rested her hand gently over mine. "The greatest mistake a dishonest person makes," she said softly, "is believing everyone else has a short memory." No applause followed. No dramatic confrontation erupted. Guests simply returned to their seats with a different understanding than the one they had carried into the room. My mother had planned a public humiliation. Instead, she became the only person in the hall who could no longer hide behind the story she had spent a lifetime telling. Her own performance had ended, not because I defeated her with anger, but because the truth had finally been given a voice. The weeks after the wedding were quieter than I expected. No furious phone calls came. No dramatic apologies arrived in the mail. Instead, the silence spread through the family the way truth often does. Slowly, steadily, changing everything without announcing itself. Relatives who had laughed that evening began reaching out one by one. Some apologized for staying silent. Others admitted they had believed my mother's version of me for years because it was easier than asking questions. Their words couldn't erase the past, but they reminded me how easily good people can mistake confidence for honesty. Daniel visited me without telling our mother. We spent hours talking, not about the property or the documents, but about childhood memories that suddenly made painful sense. For the first time, he admitted he had benefited from a system he never stopped to examine. My father called only once. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said, "I should have spoken sooner." Those 5 words carried more weight than every excuse he could have offered. As for my mother, her reputation changed without my help. I never posted the documents online. I never argued with relatives or corrected old stories. The people who had witnessed the wedding told the truth themselves. And because they had seen it with their own eyes, no one could dismiss it as my version of events. The greatest victory wasn't the cottage. It wasn't the inheritance. It was waking up each morning without feeling responsible for defending my own character. For years, I believed self-worth came from convincing the people who underestimated me that they were wrong. I finally learned something far more valuable. People determined to misunderstand you rarely change because of louder arguments. They change only when reality becomes impossible to ignore. That's why this story matters. Not because one cruel wedding gift was exposed, but because quiet truth outlasted years of carefully practiced deception, and sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to carry someone else's false version of who you are any longer. A year has passed since that wedding, and the cottage now overlooks a very different life. Ethan and I restored it slowly, preserving the old stone fireplace my grandfather built by hand and planting the garden my grandmother always dreamed of seeing in bloom again. We didn't renovate it to prove anyone wrong. We did it because, for the first time, something precious belonged to us without guilt, apology, or permission. My grandmother still visits every Sunday afternoon. She sits on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the lake shimmer beneath the evening sun, smiling with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understands that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with patience. My mother never apologized. I stopped waiting for one. That was the final freedom she could never take from me. People occasionally ask whether I regret exposing what happened that night. I always answer the same way. I didn't expose anything. I simply stopped protecting a lie that wasn't mine to carry. The family isn't the same anymore. Some relationships faded. Others became stronger because they were finally built on honesty instead of obligation. Daniel and I speak regularly now, and my father has begun the difficult work of earning trust one conversation at a time. Healing, I've learned, isn't forgetting. It's remembering without allowing the memory to decide who you become. Sometimes I think back to that small box with the faded blanket and the cruel note. Years ago, it would have broken me. Today, it feels strangely insignificant. Beside the velvet box my grandmother placed in my hands, one contained everything my mother wanted me to believe about myself. The other contained the truth. In the end, the inheritance that changed my life wasn't the cottage or the legal documents. It was the certainty that my worth had never depended on the loudest voice in the room. As the sun sets over the lake each evening, I often hear my grandmother's words echo in my mind. The truth doesn't rush, neither does peace. But when they finally arrive, they stay long after the laughter of cruel people has faded into silence.